fantastic honor to be asked to give the Opa lecture. We must understand isn't just important to folks on the continent, but is important to those of us across the whole of the diaspora as well. My aim today is to do him justice with my thoughts in this lecture. Now, as people of African descent, we don't always agree with each other, and that's fine. But I think what is healthy about our tradition of debate is that we don't always have to agree, but wherever we find ourselves on the globe, and we enter into these debates about liberation, how we've been exploited for centuries, and how it's important for us not to rely on somebody else to liberate us from the exploitation that we've suffered, whether it's on the continent or where across the Caribbean, where my family are from, and Jamaica, or anywhere else on the globe where people of African descent find ourselves. It's always going to be up to us to find those solutions to liberate ourselves. So the journey we've traveled didn't begin with enslavement. Colonization and the rampant exploitation of our people. We had a whole history before that, which the exploiters went to great lengths to take away and to try and hide from us. The debt that I want to talk about here is not merely confined to what might be owed by us to pay back the money borrowed from financial institutions and nations to rebuild after the tsunami of exploitation and looting carried out by the West. I'm suggesting a shift in our thinking when we consider who owes who what. The principle of nations making payments for the damages that they have caused is, of course, not a new one. Neither are the controversies over who should pay and who is entitled to receive any payments really controversial issues for some people. Enslaved Africans, their descendants, or even the countries from which these people were taken, were certainly not considered worthy of payments by the West. Rich European powers stole more than 20 million people out of Africa, shackled and enslaved them to transport across the Atlantic, what I usually refer to as the sacred burial grounds, worked them to the bone, and then underdeveloped the African continent through colonization. They then expected African nations to pay them back for the privilege of being exploited. Any talk of reparations for the evils of slavery and colonialism are waved away with a dismissive hand, while the other one is stretched out in an expectation that African nations pay back the massive interest the debt they supposedly owe. This, all whilst talk of reparations for enslavement and colonization is kind of waved away as if swatting an irritating fly. It is, of course, wrong to think that reparations is some new idea that has been dreamt up by Africans with some sort of chip on our collective shoulders, because that's what they often accuse us of. Why don't you leave these things in history? It was a long time ago, when actually we all know that it was not a long time ago. And many of us, for example, my great-grandfather was the first person in centuries in my family to be born a free person. This is not something that is a long time ago. Making reparations for enslavement has a long tradition, in fact. In the US, the first recorded case of a payment of reparations for enslavement was to a woman called Belinda Royal in 1783. Royal, who was born on the lands where you sit now, that's now known as Ghana, was paid a pension as compensation for her enslavement. On the reverse, from 1804, Haitians were paying their former colonial rulers, France, for the privilege of being free from enslavement. Over the following century, Haiti was forced to pay former slaveholders and their descendants the equivalent of around what's now around £23 billion. These included the Empress of Brazil, the son-in-law of the Russian Emperor Nicholas I, Germany's last imperial chancellor, and Gaston de Gallifet, the French general known as the Butcher of the Commune for crushing the insurrection in Paris in 1871. They also contributed towards the profits of Crédit Industriel in France, the bank that helped to finance the construction of the Eiffel Tower. Britain also thought it was best to make reparations payments to slave owners rather than to those who had been enslaved. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in Britain made an absolute mockery of the freeing of enslaved Africans by making around 40,000 payments, 40,000 payments worth billions of pounds in today's money to slave owners. The largest total amount paid in reparations to a slave owner in Britain was made to Sir John Gladstone, the father of a former British Prime Minister, William Gladstone. He was paid the equivalent of more than £10 million in today's money for, in quotes, losing his property, unquote, of 2,508 enslaved Africans who already enriched him on his 9 plantations in the Caribbean. The families of slave owners remained rich, while those of enslaved Africans were often left in the most gut-wrenching poverty imaginable. These simple reversals of what anybody might reasonably regard as justice are largely either unknown or ignored. Part of our job, comrades, must be to place the facts in front of people when they claim that reparations are either impossible or unreasonable. Reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans, whatever the form of the payments, is entirely reasonable and frankly long overdue. As well as the amounts that should be paid, the issue that vexes so many people is around who should pay. If, as I believe, only those that really benefited from the transatlantic slave trade should be responsible for paying reparations, then the question is, who are those with responsibility? There appears to me to be no reasonable case for reparations to be paid by workers who themselves faced exploitation from the money made from the trade in human beings. Instead, the companies and individuals and their descendants that profited from the earnings of those organizations must bear responsibility for making reparations for the ancestors of enslaved Africans. I should say that up until 2015, I've been working since I've been in work pretty much continually since 1979. And right up to 2015, I was still paying back that money that was given to the slave owner. So I was in effect paying for my own freedom. And I've continually thanked all those British workers who also paid up to 2015 when the debt was concluded. But I want to say something about Richard Drax, a former Conservative member of Parliament in Britain, who was one of the wealthiest landowners in the British House of Commons. He was worth in excess of £130 million. Frankly, he's not the only multimillionaire in the British Parliament, which is maybe another meeting and maybe another speech that I'm very happy to give at some point. But much of his wealth comes from his family's involvement in the enslavement of Africans. The Drax family used enslaved Africans to cultivate sugar on plantations on the Caribbean islands of Barbados and also where my parents were born in Jamaica. Drax remains the owner of the family's 621-acre slave plantation, Drax Hall, in Barbados. He is an extreme example where the huge wealth made by members of the British working class can be traced directly back to the transatlantic slave trade. As I mentioned earlier, members of parliament were not slow to pay themselves large sums in reparations for so-called loss of property as they passed the 1833 Act to abolish slavery. Their ancestors are still around and should be made to repay the debt. And so many more similar to Drax should also be made to pay reparations. Lloyd's of London was also a big player in the slave trade. The insurance of ships, cargo, and captured enslaved persons facilitated the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. This means the customers of Lloyd's, as well as members of its governing body, had significant connections to the transatlantic slave trade. Lloyd's of London, obviously still around and still making loads of money, which was founded in 1688, said in 2023 that it was deeply sorry for these links after an independent report found the company had played a significant role in enabling the transatlantic trade. I'm sure we all feel better that these ultra rich people in Lloyd's of London have said they were deeply sorry. But Lloyd said, not about reparations, but they said it was committed to tackling inequality and would invest some £40 million in helping impacted communities, a drop in the ocean for a company as rich as Lloyd's of London. After protests swept across the world in 2020, following the murder of African-American George Floyd by the police, pressure mounted on companies to address links to enslavement and to tackle racial inequality. At the time, Lloyd's apologized for its historic links to the slave trade and commissioned the independent report. Alexandra White, one of the professors behind the study, made clear that Lloyd's formed part of a, quote, a sophisticated network of financial interests and activities, unquote, which made the transatlantic slave trade possible. In simple terms, the trade couldn't have happened without the involvement of a company like Lloyd's. But he said the material offered very little about the people who were captured and enslaved under the practices facilitated by the Lloyd's involvement in the market. He said, quote, while the activities of insurers in the City of London may seem far removed from the plantations, ships, and the violent spaces of imprisonment along the coast of Africa, the financial architectures developed at Lloyd's helped maintain the institution of slavery. The insurance of ships, cargo, and captured enslaved persons facilitated the growth of the transatlantic slave trade. Here we have conclusive evidence carried out that talks of the absolute involvement of a company like Lloyd's. And Mr. White concluded that the customers of Lloyd's, as well as members of the governing bodies, had these significant connections to the transatlantic slave trade, as I said earlier on. So Lloyd's have kind of responded and just said, we're deeply sorry. We're resolved to take action by addressing these inequalities and will involve experienced Black and ethnically diverse individuals in working out how to carry these issues forwards. There's no real evidence that Lloyd's is doing anything. And there's no real evidence that any of these other companies who are quick with their when in fact they haven't been quick with their apologies. It has taken years to drag even a sorry out of these people. But Kahenda Andrews, Professor Kahenda Andrews, who's a professor of Black Studies at the University of Birmingham, still I think the only professor of Black Studies in Britain, dismissed the move by Lloyd's and some of these other companies as PR exercises and frankly as offensive too. Professor Andrews said if they were serious, they would be proposing a transfer of wealth to the descendants of the enslaved, not a diversity scheme for so-called ethnically diverse people, which any corporation should be doing anyway, unquote. And I agree with Professor Andrews. His comments underscore the importance of being absolutely clear-eyed about the difference between performative words and actions and things that actually make a material difference to the lives of the descendants of enslaved Africans. But Lloyd's is clearly a beneficiary of the slave trade and must not be allowed, alongside so many other companies who've benefited, to get away with not paying what is due. Banks are clearly heavily involved in the management of debt and payments across the globe. The debt that is owed by African countries to world financial institutions and the richer nations is on a scale that is almost unimaginable. But we can get a sense for the control exerted by this debt by looking at our own personal circumstances. Most of us have to make decisions about whether we can engage in the smallest activity or pay for even the smallest necessity, or if we're lucky, luxury, depending on how much money we have available. Imagine this for a country in, for example, Africa, wondering how to balance making sure that the people have food to eat, that they have access to education and healthcare, against paying back the debt that they supposedly owe. According to figures from the United Nations, public debt on the African continent stands at around, in excess really, of $1.5 trillion. This means Africa's public debt has increased by around 183% since just 2010, roughly 4 times higher than its growth rate of gross domestic product. Africa's share of external debt, i.e. the money it owes other nations or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, rose from around 19% in 2010 to just shy of 29% in 2022. So we can probably guess the figure is larger than that now. External debt as a share of exports, particularly important for Africa, where many countries rely heavily on exports, has risen from 74.5% over the same period to an absolutely staggering 140%. All of this is disturbing enough, but more so when you consider that a debt cancellation agreement for low-income countries was reached in 2005 by the foreign ministers of the group of 7 leading industrial nations. This agreement led to $130 billion, so around £104 billion of debt being cancelled for 36 countries. According to Afreximbank, Africa's debt is primarily external, with the region's external debt reaching around $1.2 trillion, so just under £1 trillion by 2023, making up nearly 60% of its total public debt. So over the past 15 years or so, this external debt has more than doubled, increasing from 18.8% of GDP in 2008 to 41.6% in 2023. I'm sorry for flinging these figures out at you, but I think it's important that we get an understanding of the size of the debts that we're actually talking about. It really is on an unimaginable scale. Before the pandemic, over 30 African countries were spending more on paying off debt than on healthcare, showing just how much debt is weighing on their budgets. Also, the fact that most of Africa's debt is concentrated in just a few countries makes the problem even worse. In 2023, 67% of the continent's external debt was held by just 10 countries: Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Mozambique, Angola, Kenya, Tunisia, Sudan, and where you're sitting now in Ghana. These countries are carrying a much bigger debt load compared to the rest, which makes them more vulnerable when debt payments spike. A recent report by Global Firepower, which tracks external debt as part of the annual defense review, shows that Egypt has the highest external debt in Africa, standing at the equivalent of £83.4 billion, ranking 50th globally. South Africa follows closely behind with £47.2 billion. Angola third with 36.8 billion. Whilst the level of a country's debt is worrying enough, arguably even more of a worry is the country's debt relative to its GDP. When, as in some African nations, debt is proportionate to GDP, the country risks experiencing an absolute economic catastrophe. The primary drawback of a high external debt to GDP ratio is the increased vulnerability it poses to external shocks and fluctuations in global financial market. It also makes these countries vulnerable to pressure from countries like the United States. And we've seen a lot of the pressure that the United States is prepared to apply through its tariff war on the rest of the world. Well, when you add on top of that the debt crisis that faces African nations, you can see that this presents an added problem for African nations to be dealing with, on top of the money that Trump wants countries to pay in additional tariffs. Debt Justice estimates that people in 54 countries are currently living in debt crisis, up from 31 in 2018 and 22 in 2015. Debt Justice, a really great organization in my view, says a debt crisis takes place where debt leads to human rights or life being denied. Now, I'm not great at maths, even though I've flung all these figures out at you. But even by my calculations, that means that things are getting worse for the people of the global south rather than better. On a geopolitical level, debt must be seen as one of the main reasons for the halting of the forward march of the global south. We will not see a healthy rebirth of the African phoenix, as I call it, until this debt question is dealt with. To press the button to restart the project in a way that will make a difference, we have to stop walking the wheel that brings us back to the same place with every step. Something different has to be done for us to end up in a different place. We hear a lot about the need for the rich global North nations to make money available to Africa, its diaspora, and the rest of the global South as reparations for the damage that their carbon emissions have caused to the environment. I agree. I think they should urgently do this. But often left out of the equation is the fact that the global North deliberately underdeveloped the South so that they could steal, whether through military power or forced labor, the abundant resources of the African continent. This theft has institutionalized poverty across Africa. It has forced nations on the continent to have to seek external financial support to support the pretense that they are actually in charge of their own economies. It is merely a pretense that they are not completely beholden to the financial institutions, monopoly capital, and the rich Western powers. The number of people in Africa living in extreme poverty is something in the region of 430 million people of its 1.6 billion population. This might only change by degrees with some performative largesse by the rich Western powers, but the reality is the nations of Africa will remain in perpetual debt unless they can break free from what can only be described as a most vicious cycle. I think if the rich nations and the likes of the World Bank and the IMF refuse to cancel the debt, as I believe they should, then the nations of Africa should take the collective action and simply refuse to pay on the basis that they can't afford to pay, and our people come first. Some parts of Africa are already taking collective action to end the long exploitation of the legacy of colonial exploitation. In West Africa, some nations are rising up against exploitation of the global north, similarly in southern Africa too, where the rich in the richest countries continue to get richer, whilst the working class and the peasant communities of the poorer nations, or the darker nations, as my friend Vijay Prashad calls it, continues to get poorer. At first glance, this might seem like a far-fetched proposal, but it's actually happened before. Argentina, Ecuador, excuse me, Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay in the past have all refused to pay debts to the World Bank, the IMF, and other financial institutions. When each of these countries stopped paying, they all managed to improve wages, pensions, and the living conditions of the population. In an act rarely mentioned, Ecuador even expelled the World Bank's permanent representative to their country. They also evicted the IMF from its offices within Ecuador's central bank and resigned from the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which is the tribunal of the World Bank, a road that Bolivia had traveled 2 years earlier. Those nations returned to economic and financial difficulties when they returned to, in quote, playing by the rules, unquote, which seems primarily to be anything that the United States says it is. Whilst I've seen plenty of arguments from rich nations of the world and the financial institutions about why such a move would be irresponsible, I've seen none that says they can't do it. I've also seen no reason why this can't pay, won't pay approach could not be replicated across Africa or any other part of the global south, and the money used to invest in their own countries to alleviate poverty. I realised that for this approach to take place, some of the client regimes or gatekeepers installed by the former colonial powers will need to be removed. That's, of course, a job for the people on the ground to determine for themselves. There is no incentive for the numerous, incredibly rich individuals and families to bite the hands that feeds the hand that keeps them in power and without being forced to do so. But as the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, something simply will inevitably give. Our job is to make sure that when change comes, it is not by another regime bent on bleeding the people dry, but one that puts people before profits and colonial domination. There are opportunities for the rich nations of the global north to at least negotiate their way out of the debt crisis that has been largely caused by them. The increasingly discredited United Nations climate conferences have been used by African nations to have the rich Western powers pay some money towards the impact of the climate emergency, again, that these Western nations have largely caused. The issue of climate debt is a reversal on who owes who and what they owe that I wanted to tackle at this point. The argument about debt is often framed in terms of Africa and other parts of the global south having to pay back what they allegedly owe to the already rich nations and the financial institutions that they largely control, as I said earlier. Rarely is the debate on debt framed in a way that dares to suggest that the rich nations of the West actually owe African nations for the rape, pillage, and exploitation that they have exacted on the continent. I challenge this view and suggest that reparatory justice can be met in a number of ways. One of those is to assist in repairing the vast environmental damage that has been caused by the rich nations of the global north. The United Nations Conference of the Parties, the COP process, has continually failed to deliver any realistic finance to help developing countries deal with the impact of the worsening climate emergency, as 144 countries face the worst debt crisis in history. The fact that there are 193 UN recognized sovereign countries actually illustrates the depth of the debt crisis facing the beleaguered global south. A report earlier this year by the campaign group Debt Relief International, carried out from the Norwegian Church Aid, shows that repaying the debt is absorbing 41.5% of the budget revenues, 41.6% of spending, and 8.4% of gross domestic product on average across the 144 developing countries. Health and education budgets have been slashed by debt-enslaved countries in Africa, as nearly half of national budgets are used to pay creditors. Yes, we are actually now in another period of enslavement of Africans. This paralyzing debt enslavement halts any attempts by the world's poorest nations to break away from the control of the self-appointed masters of the universe and the small but powerful cabal of Western countries led by the United States. Africa needs to escape this extractive, exploitative, and abusive relationship that it's been subjected to by Western powers. I was once told that there's little point in merely finding ways of coping with an abusive relationship. One must find the means and the strength to leave it. It is unacceptable for a continent as rich and abundant as Africa to be in a position where it imports around 85% of its food, with much of this food only affordable to tourists and the well-to-do on the continent. Dagfinn Høybråten, the Secretary General of Norwegian Church Aid, said at the time that the report was released that high debt burdens are, quote, a huge drain on a country's economy and hits the poorer parts of the population first through cuts in welfare, education, or health expenditure to pay debts. A debt crisis is paralyzing and undermines all other development efforts, unquote. As bad as the situation is now, the truth is that the outlook for the future is worse as developing nations face additional pressures, such as dealing with the impact of the climate emergency and whatever the next pandemic is and what it brings. But the global north, unsurprisingly, continues to refuse to do the right thing. They refuse to pay for the damage they have caused to the planet, impacted most heavily on the world's poorest nations. The COP29 conference of last year in Azerbaijan, in the Azerbaijani capital Baku, agreed to make available a paltry $300 billion, around £239 billion, for developing countries who need cash to cope with the transition from coal, oil, and gas that causes the globe to overheat. But it's nowhere near the $1.3 trillion, just over a trillion pounds, that developing countries were actually demanding. Responding to this, one climate activist from the Global South is alleged to have described the amount being made available as, quote, not even enough money to pay for the coffins we will need, unquote, as people die off from the impacts of climate change. It is the clearest indication possible that the world's richest nations are interested only in getting richer and do not care about the impoverishment caused by them across huge swathes of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, they've also been able to incorporate some Global South misleaders to maintain these horrendous levels of poverty as a means of controlling working class and peasant communities. These so-called misleaders have been willing to do the bidding of their masters in the north for the thickening of their personal offshore bank accounts. To be fair, even many of these leaders appear to understand the basic equation that unless something is done, climate change will mean that they will actually have no people or country left to mislead. Those die-hard supporters of the West that remain must be made to understand that it is no longer in their interests to ignore the interests of their own people, millions of whom have no idea from one day to the next how they're going to put bread on the table or keep a roof over their heads. In places such as Kenya, more than 90% of the economy is informal, with people having to find creative ways to make a living. This is far from unusual across the Global South and means there is no degree of certainty for millions of people over how they're going to survive. As the massive debt burden continues to bite and the climate emergency adds to the woes of the Global South, survival in this abusive relationship is simply not an option. Abusive relationships all too often end with the abused being killed. We need to help organize the intervention into the abusive relationship so the nations being abused can stage a collective getaway. For decades, there have been calls for the debt to be cancelled. We must recharge these calls. Not only should the debt be cancelled, but the debate should be turned into one about how much money these rich nations actually owe the Global South for the exploitation and damage they have caused. The rich nations of the Global North must not be allowed to continue to claim the impracticality of cancelling the debt. There is a precedent for this. After reversing a decision to keep the defeated Germans impoverished after World War II, the Western victors instead decided to turn Germany into an economic powerhouse as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. This led to the cancellation of around 50% of the debt owed by Germany. They simply do not wish to do the same at any significant level for any of the nations of the Global South, around 80% of the global population, that they keep firmly under their iron heel through debt enslavement. The debate, comrades, is the wrong way round. We should be talking about the money the rich exploiter countries owe the Global South rather than the other way round. There should be a commitment from the nations of the Global South to agree to stop paying a debt, as I said earlier on, that was forced on them and which in any case they simply cannot afford. There can be no serious progress by the nations of the Global South until this neo-enslavement is ended. That requires the leaders in these countries to do what's best for their own populations rather than the transnational corporations that mostly benefit from these high levels of debt and the exploitative relationship with the Global South that it ingrains. But the question remains as to whether the debt owed by Western nations can ever really genuinely be repaid. How can the centuries of exploitation, rape, and pillage of the peoples and resources of the continent of Africa ever be repaid? Can the fact that I will likely never know exactly who I am descended from ever be compensated? I'm sure that boffins will be able to come up with an approximate sum to account for the hours of free labour during enslavement and colonialism. Can the forced detachment from our families and the loss of our families' culture and lands, never mind the torture and murder inflicted on Africans, ever actually be monetized? I doubt it very much. Can a figure be identified that will compensate for the artifacts looted from Africa by the colonial powers? I doubt that too. But they can make a start on righting the severe wrongs that they have enacted against the people of Africa, wherever they are in the world, who have been left to pick up the pieces after centuries of racism and exploitation. One of my major annoyances around the debate over debt and reparations is the way that people of African descent are told by white people, including on the left, how best to wage this fight for justice. They tell us what Africans should legitimately demand in reparations, and that the white working class in the belly of the beast should not be made to pay for the excesses of the ruling class. They say this on the one hand, whilst on the other, they make it clear that we should always follow the lead of those forces engaged in at the head of liberation, socialist or communist movements across the world. I have to say that being told by these comrades exactly how I, as somebody of African descent, should seek justice for the wrongs that have been committed against us is really annoying and deeply disrespectful, to say the least. I also don't believe that the white working class should be made to pay for the excesses and exploitation carried out by the ruling classes across the globe. The problem is that whatever people of African descent manage to extract from those who still, by the way, profit from slavery is inevitably going to be passed on through higher prices, etc. One way of bypassing this dilemma is to have a windfall tax on the profits of those entities that can be shown to still be profiting from the legacy of enslavement of Africans. A mechanism can be worked out for how this windfall tax can be distributed to the descendants of enslavement through cash, grants, scholarships, or a range of other mechanisms designed to contribute towards putting right some of the wrongs of the past. There must also be a commitment to returning the stolen loot from that was taken out of Africa. Many of these artifacts that are now on display in Western museums are where they are because they were stolen from Africa. Many of these items are precious cultural and religious artifacts that should be in Africa for use in whatever way the people who they belong to choose. We do not need advice from museums on how to look after these artifacts. They often say they're worried about how these items will be looked after when if they go back to where they were originally from. You know what? Not your problem. Africa is not a place full of primitive savages with no notion of how best to look after our belongings. The continent is as sophisticated as anywhere else on the planet, and I'm sure capable of working out the best way of taking care of things that are precious to us. But it is Africa's problem and nobody else's. Why should we take advice from people that have stolen from us about the best way of taking care of the loot they are returning? The failure to return the stolen booty to Africa is deeply racist and must end immediately. It is only part of what the former colonial powers are responsible for this theft should be doing. The thing that will make the biggest difference to achieving debt justice and reparations is the building of collective movements for progress across the global south that will finally force an end to this wretched enslavement we as Africans still experience to this day. In conclusion, comrades and friends, we must not wait for some kind of Harriet Tubman figure to arrive to lead us out of neo-enslavement. We must organize collectively on an international basis to say enough is enough. We are out of here. Thanks very much for listening.